Hey there, in this video I want to talk about Dragon Visage lore and why the dragons have the visages that they do. Fair warning, this lore has changed some over time, and I'll be covering those changes as well, but it might get a little convoluted. I think we should first go over what a visage even is. Visages are effectively when a dragon gets a new magical body in order to blend in with races easier, and to make communication more effective. At least in the earlier days of Warcraft, most races would not allow a dragon to just come up to them and have a peaceful conversation. Visage forms in WoW also allowed for the dragons to express emotions better with others of their own kind, at least according to some of the earlier books of the franchise, where they often enjoyed being in visage form simply because they are able to hug and embrace one another, which they couldn't do very easily in their natural forms. Interestingly enough, a lot of other franchises also incorporate the use of visage forms for dragons. Usually in those other franchises, dragons all take on the form of an elf. One of my personal favorite franchises to do this also has an Easter egg about visage forms in Dragonflight. In Xerolet Cavern, during the 10.1 quest campaign, the Black Dragons talk about how the area is causing them to receive maddening whispers and temptations, much like Neltharion had before his fall. But being in their visage form reduces these whispers to almost nothing. This bit of lore is an Easter egg connection to the Fire Emblem series, where the dragons had been cursed to go insane. To prevent this, they return part of their essence to the earth by binding themselves with gemstones that would be called their dragon stones. Once bound, they turn into elven visages and didn't have the fear of going insane. But if they go back to their true form and stay in it for too long, they would go insane. But anywho, back to WoW lore. Originally, visage forms were changeable at will, and a dragon would often switch to whatever people they are interacting with, so that they would be accepted with open arms. The green dragons, for instance, mainly encountered night elves, as they were the only civilization for a good chunk of Azeroth's history that were actively interacting with and going into the Emerald Dream, which, if you didn't know, 90% of all green dragons live and stay within the Emerald Dream, rarely actually showing up on Azeroth. Naturally, these green dragons took on the forms of night elves mainly, in order to figure out who they were, what they wanted, and to make sure they weren't going to harm the dream. Eventually, the green dragons as a whole would form a deep bond and love for the night elves, even forming the first ever group of dragon riders in the World of Warcraft canon. Bronze and blue dragons would often take on the form of high elves and blood elves. These elves were the most likely to be messing around with time magic or interacting with the ley lines. It's no secret that the Thalassian elves were the most gifted with magic and magically inclined race as a whole until the unveiling of Nightborn. Red dragons, surprisingly enough, are also a very magical people, with red dragon magic being a mixture of fire, arcane, and nature magic, which is why it looks kind of pink in-game when Drakthir or various other red dragons in Dragonflight cast spells. This is called their living flame. One of the most prominent red dragons, Corialstrasz, would take on the guise of the high elf Krasus and become an archmage of the Kirin Tor, where he advised and influenced the advancement of several governments and peoples worldwide. High elves are often thought to be more gifted in the ways of magic, and taking on a high elven visage attracts less attention than it would for a human to be casting such advanced levels of magic. On top of that, the red dragon's main lair is that of the Vermilion Redoubt in what is now the Twilight Highlands, which is around where the first humans were taught magic by the high elves. Naturally, this would have most red dragons taking on the appearance of the advanced magical society near their homes. The Blackflight, however, mainly took on the role of humans. This was largely to stay hidden. A random human almost anywhere on Azeroth wouldn't stir up notice, allowing them to easily avoid detection. At this point in time, most black dragons were despised and had some form of corruption within them, so staying mostly out of the public eye was pretty much their bread and butter for survival. However, things would change with some modern retcons that happened, starting with Battle for Azeroth. In the book Before the Storm, when Jaina enters Dalaran to inform Kalecgos that she was going to break up with him to focus on herself and to try and reunite with her family in Kul Tiras, with it being a journey she needed to take alone by herself. We find out more about the Visage Day ceremony, which is an important event in dragon culture. This is when a dragon discovers their visage form. Specifically, we find out more about Calyx's Visage Day. On his Visage Day, he looks deep within himself and thought about the truths of his life. He was torn between loving his own dragon kind, while also having a strong and intense love for the mortal races, whom he often ended up spending the most time with. Because of this duality, his visage form manifested in a half-elf, a true representation of a being who was torn between two worlds. This would start the newer dragon lore, of visage forms being a reflection of the soul that is manifested and brought forth. Another prime example that we would hear a lot about is Chronormu, who, despite being born a male bronze dragon, Chronormu's soul presented itself as a female gnome on Chronormu's Visage Day. Since then, Chronormu took on the she-her pronouns and started to go by Chromie. Another example within Dragonflight is the leader of the Dark Talons, Cinderthresh. Unless it's a bug in the quest text, Cinderthresh's soul presents as a form of gender fluid, being a female in Dracthea form and a male in Visage form, using differing pronouns for both. Also within Dragonflight, we get the new quest chain about Emberthal's Visage Day, where we go around asking various people what it means to them to be who they are, so that Emberthal can pinpoint her inner truths to form a visage form. At the end, she chooses she is happier how she is, and that she doesn't want to take on a visage form. In light of this newer lore, I believe the reasoning for the visage forms in general of the major flights are as follows. Red, bronze, blue, and green dragons are mostly elves due to the level of arcane magic in their bodies. We know that dragons evolved from proto-dragons into various other dragon forms due to large amounts of arcane magic, which was first pumped into the aspects during their ascension, and then the aspects later would use their new magic to uplift other dragons who would follow them. We also, thanks to the books in Oldemon and throughout Dragonflight, know that the ancestral waters of Tyrhold are also teeming with arcane magic to help the dragons grow strong and powerful, with arcane magic also being the key catalyst that turned trolls into night elves, and then would further turn night elves into high elves. So it stands to reason that a large amount of arcane magic could reasonably affect one's visage form if it's a combination of biological and soul-like things. As for the black dragons, the reason they are more often than not still humans, I believe, is due to the Curse of the Flesh and Yogg-Saron. Most black dragons suffered from Old God corruption after Neltharion fell, with Old Gods having created the Curse of Flesh, and humans eventually being a byproduct of Titan creation and the Curse of the Flesh. These things would also help explain, while even back on the Dragon Isles before the Sundering, Alexstrasza, Nosdormu, and Malygos are all canonically High Elves, when we know based on the current lore that High Elves didn't quite exist yet in the world. And as a bonus, it could also explain why the Dracthyr are only able to take on the visages that we see. This is hinted at by Rathian, Aziraphale, and Cinderthresh, with some of them even wondering if it's because of how they were made. Being a dragony elf of sorts would track if arcane magic levels was a contributing factor in their visage form, on top of the fact that they were made by combining dragon essence, draconids, and arcane magic. If you've made it this far into the video, I'd like to give you a huge thank you, as well as asking you to consider giving this video a like or subscribing.